April 5th, 1976. A private jet tears through the airspace over the Gulf of Mexico. Inside the cabin, paramedics are staring at a body on a stretcher that barely looks human. He weighs exactly 90 pounds. His matted hair reaches the middle of his back. His fingernails are thick, yellowed claws, curling inches past his fingertips. Broken hypodermic needles are snapped off, permanently embedded in the rotting flesh of his arms. He is so emaciated, so completely disfigured by neglect, that the FBI cannot identify him by looking at his face. They have to roll his skeletal fingers on an ink pad to lift his prints. When the match comes back, it defies all logic. This broken, withered ghost is the wealthiest man in the United States of America. This is Howard Hughes, the aviation pioneer who conquered the skies, the Hollywood mogul who owned the silver screen, the billionaire who literally bought the Las Vegas Strip just so no one could tell him what to do. He possessed an empire worth $2.5 billion, a level of wealth that essentially made him a god among men. So how does a god end up dying like a stray dog in the dark? This is not a story of financial ruin. Howard Hughes never lost his billions. He kept every single cent. What he lost was his mind. This is the terrifying anatomy of absolute power, a psychological horror story of a man who used infinite wealth to build an impenetrable fortress to keep the entire world out, only to realize when it was far too late that he had locked the monster inside with him.
Madness is not an accident, it is an architecture. To understand how a brilliant man becomes a rotting prisoner in his own mind, you cannot just look at the end of his life. You have to look at who laid the bricks of his cell. For Howard Hughes, the bricks were forged in limitless, unimaginable wealth, and the mortar holding them together was pure, unadulterated terror. The story of his absolute power begins with a piece of steel. In 1909, his father, Howard Hughes Sr., invented the dual-cone roller rock bit. Before this invention, drilling for oil through hard rock was a brutal, often impossible gamble. The Hughes drill bit chewed through solid rock with terrifying efficiency. It revolutionized the oil industry overnight. But Howard Sr. was not just an inventor, he was a ruthless capitalist. He refused to sell the drill bits, he only leased them. This single business decision created an absolute, unbreakable monopoly. Every time an oil derrick struck black gold in the United States, the Hughes family got a cut. The money did not just flow into their Houston estate, it flooded. By the time young Howard was a boy, the Hughes Tool Company was not just a business, it was an infinite money-printing machine. Howard was raised with a fundamental understanding of the universe. Money was not something you earned. It was a limitless resource, like oxygen. It was a weapon. But wealth of that magnitude always creates a fortress, and inside the Hughes fortress lived a monster. The primary architect of Howard's mental destruction was his mother, Aileen Hughes. Aileen was consumed by a severe clinical case of mysophobia, an extreme, irrational fear of germs and contamination. This was the early 20th century, an era before penicillin, when diseases like polio and influenza swept through cities like invisible reapers. To Aileen, the world outside their front door was not a society, it was a biological weapon. She projected this paralyzing terror onto her only son with a ferocity that bordered on child abuse. She did not raise Howard, she quarantined him. Every single day of his childhood was a brutal ritual of sterilization. Aileen subjected him to obsessive, exhaustive physical examinations. She checked his teeth, his pores, his bowel movements. She did not bathe him, she sanitized him. She would scrub his skin with harsh, caustic antiseptic soaks, scrubbing for hours until his skin was raw, red, and literally bleeding. She isolated him from other children, absolutely terrified that a neighborhood boy might breathe a fatal germ into his son's lungs. She taught him that a doorknob was a threat, a handshake was a death sentence.
Howard's brain was being systematically wired for paranoia. He learned that human contact was a vector for disease. He learned that the only way to be safe was to be completely, entirely separate. This was the exact moment the seed of his obsessive-compulsive disorder was planted. It was watered daily with boiling water, lye soap, and his mother's suffocating, toxic love. Then, the fortress collapsed. In 1922, when Howard was just 16 years old, his mother died from complications during a minor surgery. The woman who had controlled his every breath was suddenly gone. Less than 2 years later, his father suffered a massive heart attack and died right in front of him. At 18 years old, Howard Hughes was entirely alone in the world. But he was not a normal orphan. He was an orphan who had just inherited the keys to a global monopoly. Most teenagers who lose their parents seek comfort in friends, extended family, or the warmth of human connection. Howard had none of those things. His mother had so thoroughly pruned his social world that he lacked the basic emotional tools to connect with another human soul. He was a billionaire, but he was emotionally hollow. He was completely bankrupt on the inside. So what does a boy with infinite capital and zero emotional intelligence do? He buys reality. Instead of mourning like a normal child, he calculated. He ruthlessly bought out his own relatives, taking 100% total control of the Hughes Tool Company. He realized something incredibly dangerous. If you have enough money, you do not need to be loved. You do not need to trust people. You do not need to compromise, adapt, or build real relationships. You can simply buy control. The wealth became his surrogate parent. It became his impenetrable armor against the invisible germs his mother taught him to fear, and his weapon against the terrifying unpredictability of other human beings. He didn't need friends, he could buy employees. He didn't need love, he could buy obedience. At 18, he packed his bags, took his infinite fortune, and headed to Hollywood. He was going to build his own world, entirely unaware that he was carrying his mother's prison right inside his head.
When Howard Hughes descended upon Hollywood in the late 1920s, he did not arrive as a starving artist begging for studio backing. He arrived as an invading force. He took the infinite gushing capital of the Texas oil fields and weaponized it against the silver screen. He didn't just want to make movies, he wanted to bend reality to his absolute will. To the public, he was a dashing, eccentric visionary, but behind the closed doors of the sound stages, his perfectionism was not a sign of artistic dedication. It was the early, aggressive manifestation of a severe psychiatric disorder. Hughes decided to produce Hell's Angels, a massive World War I aviation epic. But a standard Hollywood production with miniatures and optical illusions was unacceptable to a mind that demanded absolute, symmetrical control. The obsession gestating in his brain demanded terrifying authenticity. Hughes didn't just build sets, he bought an actual private air force of vintage biplanes. He hired dozens of the most reckless stunt pilots in the country. He burned through millions of dollars, halting production for months simply because the cloud formations in the background did not perfectly match the rigid image he demanded in his head. When the professional directors he hired told him a specific, highly dangerous aerial maneuver was statistically impossible to film safely, Hughes did not compromise. He simply fired them. He climbed into the cockpit himself. He pushed the throttle forward, drove the plane into a violent, screaming dive, and crashed it straight into the earth. He shattered his cheekbone and fractured his skull. But when he woke up in the hospital, bloody and broken, his only concern was whether the cameras had caught the impact. The press labeled him a dedicated genius. They called him a martyr for his art. But it was a catastrophic misdiagnosis. This was not dedication. This was a complete clinical loss of control. It was a man whose brain could not tolerate a reality that deviated even 1 millimeter from his internal expectations. And he was willing to die to force the world to align with his sickness. But Hollywood was only the beginning. Hughes wanted to own the sky itself. He expanded his empire,
purchasing a controlling stake in Trans World Airlines and transforming it into a global powerhouse. He established Hughes aircraft, building state-of-the-art military technology. In 1938, he climbed into a Lockheed Super Electra and shattered the record for flying around the world, completing the agonizing journey in just 91 hours. When he landed in New York, he was greeted by a ticker tape parade massive enough to rival the President of the United States. He was the undisputed master of the air. Yet, as his global power expanded, the microscopic world inside his head began to shrink and rot. The clinical obsessive-compulsive disorder, planted by his mother, began to metastasize, mutating from eccentric perfectionism into paralyzing, irrational fixations. While directing the film The Outlaw, his obsession suddenly fixated on the anatomy of his lead actress, Jane Russell. He became deeply, irrationally disturbed by the visible seams and folds of her undergarments on camera. His brain snagged on the minor imperfection and refused to let go. He completely halted the multi-million-dollar film shoot. He called in his top aeronautical engineers from Hughes Aircraft, men who designed fighter planes for the U.S. military, and ordered them to apply the principles of bridge construction and aerodynamics to design a seamless, mathematically perfect brassiere. To the public, this sounded like a quirky, amusing Hollywood anecdote. In reality, it was a terrifying symptom. His mind was fracturing. Soon, the obsession with the microscopic took over. The paralyzing fear of germs, his mother's dark legacy, resurfaced with a vengeance. He began forcing his staff to wash their hands dozens of times a day until their skin cracked. He demanded that doors be opened only with multiple layers of tissue paper. He created bizarre, multi-step manuals just for handing him a document or a glass of water. And this is where the true tragedy of extreme wealth is revealed. If Howard Hughes was a normal middle-class man, his family or his friends would have intervened. They would have taken him to a hospital. They would have told him he was sick. But Howard Hughes was a billionaire, and billionaires do not have friends. They have payrolls. He was surrounded by an army of executives, lawyers, assistants, and fixers. These men saw the madness. They saw the bizarre rituals, the bleeding hands, the psychotic paranoia. But to stop him meant to stop the infinite flow of money. To say no to Howard Hughes meant losing their mansions, their luxury cars, and their immense power. So the system made a cold, calculated decision. They did not treat the sick man. They enabled the monster. They followed his insane, germ-phobic protocols without question. They built a sterile, padded bubble around him, actively protecting his madness from the outside world because his madness was paying their salaries. They became the architects of his invisible prison, locking the door from the outside while he slowly drowned on the inside.
Every Greek tragedy requires a moment where the mortal defies the gods and the gods strike back. For Howard Hughes, that moment arrived on July 7, 1946. He had spent his entire adult life trying to conquer the earth, the silver screen, and the microscopic world. Now he was determined to conquer the sky. He climbed into the cockpit of the XF-11, a massive experimental twin-engine reconnaissance plane designed for the United States military. It was a beautiful, terrifying machine. And like everything else in his empire, Hughes refused to let anyone else control it. He took off from Culver City, but 15 minutes into the flight, the machine rebelled. A catastrophic leak in the right propeller system caused it to violently reverse its pitch. The aircraft, acting as if it had hit an invisible brick wall in midair, violently banked and began to plummet. Howard Hughes, the man who believed he could buy his way out of any consequence, was suddenly trapped in a metal coffin falling out of the sky. The plane tore through the affluent neighborhood of Beverly Hills. It sliced through the roof of one house, annihilated a second, and slammed into a third, erupting into a colossal, roaring fireball. When a Marine sergeant pulled Hughes from the burning wreckage, he was not looking at a billionaire. He was looking at a corpse that simply hadn't stopped breathing yet.
The physical destruction was absolute. His left lung had completely collapsed, his collarbone was obliterated, his ribs were shattered in multiple places, puncturing his internal organs. His chest was crushed so severely that his heart was physically shifted to the right side of his chest cavity. Third-degree burns blistered across his hands, his face, and his body. He was given a 50-50 chance of surviving the night, but Howard Hughes did survive. And that survival was the worst thing that could have possibly happened to his mind. To comprehend the permanent shattering of his sanity, you have to look at the immediate aftermath of the crash. The pain he experienced was not just severe, it was apocalyptic. To keep his heart from stopping due to the sheer agony, doctors introduced him to a new kind of power. They pumped his veins full of morphine. They gave him heavy doses of codeine. This was the fatal gateway. For a normal patient, opiates are a temporary bridge to recovery, but Howard Hughes was not a normal patient. His brain was already a fragile, infected architecture of severe obsessive-compulsive disorder and paranoid misophobia. Injecting heavy, mind-altering narcotics into that specific psychological cocktail was like throwing a lit match into a powder keg. The drugs did numb the physical agony of his crushed ribs, but they also dissolved the very last thin walls of his sanity. The opiates blurred the line between his terrifying hallucinations and reality. They made the invisible germs seem larger, more aggressive, and entirely real. Yet even as he lay broken in a hospital bed, hovering between life and death, the ultimate illusion of the billionaire mind took over. The illusion of absolute control. Hughes despised the standard hospital bed. He hated the way it forced him to lie flat. He hated the agonizing pain it caused when the nurses tried to move him. A normal man would have gritted his teeth and endured the process. Hughes did not endure, he engineered. Immobilized, wrapped in bandages like a mummy, he summoned his top aeronautical engineers to his hospital room. He barked orders through the heavy haze of morphine. He commanded them to design a revolutionary motorized bed. It featured push-button hydraulics, customizable sections to support his shattered spine, and hot and cold running water controlled entirely by the patient. Lying in the ruins of his own body, he literally invented the modern hospital bed. To the press, this was the ultimate testament to his unstoppable genius. "The billionaire defies death," the headlines cheered. But it was not a triumph, it was a tragedy. It was the ultimate, darkest manifestation of a sick mind. Howard Hughes genuinely believed that with enough money and enough engineering, he could control human mortality. He believed he could micromanage the healing of his own shattered bones. He believed he could build a machine to keep the chaotic, germ-infested world away from him forever. The XF-11 crash did not just break his body, it broke the seal on his madness. When he finally left that hospital bed, he was no longer a visionary. He was a high-functioning addict, completely enslaved by his compulsions. He had survived the fire, but he was about to lock himself in the dark forever. By the late 1960s, the dashing aviator and the Hollywood playboy had been entirely erased from existence. Howard Hughes did not just step out of the public eye, he evaporated. He became a phantom, a modern-day myth that people whispered about but never saw. The man who had once conquered the boundless open skies now found the entire universe to be a terrifying, contaminated threat. His world began to shrink. First, it shrank to a single city, then to a single building, and finally to a single, suffocating room. The descent into absolute, irreversible madness accelerated in the winter of 1966. Under the cover of darkness, Hughes arrived in Las Vegas on a private train, moving like a fugitive. He took the freight elevator up to the top floor of the Desert Inn Hotel and locked the door to the penthouse. He intended to stay for a few days to escape the taxes and the crowds of California. But as the weeks dragged on, the hotel management grew impatient. They needed the luxury penthouse for their high-rolling casino guests. They politely asked the eccentric billionaire to pack his bags and leave. Most men would have simply checked out. Howard Hughes did not. Confronted with the terrifying prospect of going outside, of exposing himself to the germ-infested air and the unpredictable public, his diseased mind calculated a different solution. He didn't argue with the management. He simply opened his checkbook and bought the entire Desert Inn hotel for $13 million. To the outside world, this sounded like the ultimate flex of billionaire power, a man so rich he bought a casino just to avoid packing his suitcase. But in reality, it was an act of profound, pathetic desperation. He wasn't buying a hotel, he was buying a fortress. He was buying a tomb. Once he owned the building, the final quarantine began. Hughes ordered his staff to black out every single window in the penthouse. Heavy drapes were pulled tight and taped shut. The sunlight, which he now considered impure, was permanently banished. He ordered the doors sealed with thick layers of masking tape to prevent microscopic dust particles from drifting in from the hallway. He installed heavy-duty air purifiers that hummed endlessly in the dark. Inside this pitch-black, climate-controlled vacuum, the richest man in America mutated into a monster. The visual reality of his daily life inside that room is almost too grotesque to comprehend. Because he believed that clothing carried dust, lint, and deadly bacteria, he stopped wearing it entirely. He sat completely naked in a leather reclining chair in the center of the dark room, his emaciated frame draped only in a thin white napkin to cover his genitals. Because he was terrified that nail clippers and scissors could cause microabrasions and lead to a fatal infection, he refused to let anyone cut his hair or trim his nails. His hair grew into a matted, filthy tangle down his back, his nails curled into thick, yellowed horns. He was absolutely paralyzed by his obsessive-compulsive disorder. If he needed to pick up a telephone or turn a doorknob, he would require his aides to hand him a pristine box of Kleenex. He would use multiple layers of tissue paper to touch the object, terrified of direct skin contact, and then discard the tissues on the floor. The penthouse became a landscape of towering, discarded Kleenex mountains. Because the bathroom was deemed a highly contaminated biological hazard zone, he refused to use the toilet. Instead, he relieved himself into empty glass milk bottles, which he meticulously lined up across the floor, storing his own waste in a bizarre, pathetic display of control. And in the background, playing on a continuous, endless loop, was a projector. His mind, broken and fragmented, could no longer process new information. He needed extreme, predictable repetition to soothe his agonizing anxiety. He chose a Cold War espionage movie called Ice Station Zebra, a film about men trapped in the freezing, isolated expanse of the Arctic. He watched it over and over and over again. It is estimated that he viewed that single movie more than 150 times, sitting naked in the dark, staring blankly at the flickering screen, while his empire ran itself. But a multi-billion-dollar empire does not actually run itself. It is run by men, and the men who ran the Hughes empire were a highly specialized, fiercely loyal group of aides known as the Mormon Mafia. He hired them because he believed that members of the Latter-day Saint Church who abstained from alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine were physically and morally pure. He believed they would not contaminate his sterile sanctuary, but he made a fatal miscalculation. These men saw his rotting teeth. They saw the bed sores covering his skeletal body. They saw the milk bottles filled with urine and the mountains of tissue paper. They saw a man severely addicted to Valium and codeine, slipping in and out of drug-induced comas. If they had called a doctor or a psychiatrist or an ambulance, they could have saved his life. But saving his life meant taking away his power. It meant bringing in the authorities. It meant shutting off the infinite fountain of money that they controlled in his absence. So they did nothing. They became his enablers, his gatekeepers, and ultimately his wardens. They fed his drug addiction to keep him docile. They manipulated him into signing sweeping corporate documents while he was high on opiates, slowly usurping control of his entire conglomerate. The terrifying paradox of Howard Hughes was finally complete. The man who had spent his entire life using his billions to buy control over other people had accidentally bought his own captors. The machine he built to protect himself had turned around, locked the door, and swallowed him whole. On April 5, 1976, Howard Hughes took to the sky one final time. His inner circle, the men who had watched him waste away in darkened hotel rooms for a decade, finally realized that the golden goose was taking its last breaths. They chartered a private jet to fly him from Acapulco, Mexico, back to his hometown of Houston, Texas, for emergency medical treatment. But he never made it. Somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, at 30,000 feet, the heart of the billionaire simply stopped beating. He was 70 years old, but his abused, emaciated body looked like it belonged to a 90-year-old vagrant. The man who had once shattered global aviation records from the cockpit died as a broken passenger in the cabin, completely unaware of his surroundings. When the news broke, the world was stunned. The sheer scale of his wealth was incomprehensible. His estate was valued at $2.5 billion. He left behind a sprawling empire of aviation companies, real estate, and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which, in a stroke of bitter, cosmic irony, is now one of the wealthiest medical research organizations on Earth, funded entirely by a man who was utterly destroyed by medical paranoia. But what is the true legacy of Howard Hughes? His life stands as the ultimate, terrifying testament to the absolute limits of capital. We are taught to believe that money is the ultimate shield, that wealth equals freedom, that if you just have enough billions, you can insulate yourself from the pain of the human condition. Howard Hughes proved that if your mind is a prison, all the money in the world only buys you thicker bars. His billions could buy the desert inn, they could buy the absolute silence of his aides, they could buy a fleet of private jets and the largest movie studios in Hollywood. But $2.5 billion could not buy him a single, solitary second of peace. It could not buy him a moment of genuine human connection. It could not buy an escape from the invisible monsters crawling inside his own head. Howard Hughes was the ultimate Icarus. He possessed the brilliance and the capital to build wings of steel and fire. He flew higher, faster, and further than any man of his generation. But when his mind fractured and his wings finally melted, he did not plummet into the ocean. He fell into the darkest, most terrifying abyss imaginable, his own mind. And the absolute tragedy of the billionaire hermit is that he never hit the bottom.